Imagine trying to lead a region that's simultaneously battling economic fragility, intense climate stress, and deep systemic inequality. I mean, how do you even begin to tackle that? It's a massive, almost overwhelming leadership question. But the thing is, it's not hypothetical at all. This is the exact complex reality right now in Western Asia and the Arab region. And honestly, navigating it requires a really unique blend of diplomacy, economics, and just sheer operational willpower.
So before we get into the weeds of how someone actually tackles a challenge of this magnitude, let's set the stage. We are looking at ESCWA today. That's the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. Their official mandate is incredibly ambitious. It's to promote economic and social development through regional cooperation. But as you can imagine, in a region that's marked by such intense diversity and overlapping conflicts, fulfilling that mandate is anything but simple. So, welcome to this explainer. Today we are taking a high-energy deep dive into the actual strategic blueprint that was prepared for a top-tier UN leadership role. We're going to decode the exact playbook designed for the Executive Secretary of ESCWA. And look, this isn't just a bunch of high-level theory. It's a highly practical, on-the-ground guide for driving real, tangible transformation in the region. To make this massive bureaucratic document actually accessible, here is our game plan. First, the context of leadership. Second, regional transformation. Third, the execution toolkit. Fourth, environmental threats. And finally, the human core. All right, let's jump right in. Okay, part 1, the Regional Leadership Playbook, focusing on the context of leadership. Before we look at the actual policies, we really have to look at the person. Who is the candidate behind this vision, and what is their overarching philosophy for taking on such a demanding role? So this strategic guide is tailored specifically for candidate Basel Youssef El-Habil. And we aren't just talking about your traditional sits-in-a-boardroom diplomat here. El-Habil brings deep, incredibly practical field reality to the table. He's got extensive experience with UNRWA, vocational training, information and communication tech, statistics, and crucially, crisis management. This is all about bridging that gap between managing literal emergencies on the ground and leading high-level regional policy.
Now, doing this requires a massive philosophical shift. See, the old way of doing things relies on isolated single-sector programs. Abstract reports that basically just gather dust on a shelf somewhere. But the El-Habil way demands systems thinking. It's this crucial realization that fiscal fragility, social protection, and climate stress are all deeply, deeply interconnected. You literally can't fix one without dealing with the others. So his strategy shifts the whole focus to interconnected policies and, most importantly, budgeted real-world reforms.
Moving right along to Section 2, Platform for Regional Transformation, Synthesizing the Strategy. Now that we've got the mindset down, let's open up the actual policy document itself.
50. Yep, 50. That is the sheer scale of the strategic guide we're analyzing today. It contains 50 deeply detailed, entirely distinct points for regional transformation. And let's be real, in any typical bureaucracy, trying to manage 50 different priorities is just a recipe for losing focus entirely. So how in the world do we make sense of this?
Well, we synthesize. We can take those 50 dense bureaucratic points and distill them into 3 massive, perfectly digestible strategic pillars: economic diplomacy and data, climate resilience, and the human core. This right here is how you prevent a massive regional commission from devolving into a fragmented mess. By grouping the entire strategy into these 3 core areas, the whole vision suddenly becomes actionable and, better yet, measurable.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Execution Toolkit, turning abstract policy into real results. This is the part where the leader basically becomes an architect. It's all about how El-Habil plans to build an integrated system to actually accelerate these development goals.
He applies a very disciplined, repeating operational cycle to every single priority. Step 1, establish regional legitimacy, meaning you make sure every member state actually sees its own priorities reflected. Step 2, translate operationally. Take the idea and turn it into a physical toolkit or model legislation. Step 3, ensure data quality. Back it all up with hard disaggregated statistics. And Step 4, align financing. Figure out who's actually paying for it and how it gets budgeted. This cycle right here is exactly how ideas escape the realm of abstract talk and become budgeted realities.
And the whole crux of this is summarized beautifully in this quote, straight from the source text. ESCWA's credibility depends on combining intellectual authority with implementation relevance. Basically, it's not enough to just be the smartest people in the room. The knowledge you produce absolutely must be usable for real institutional decisions. Because if the research doesn't actually lead to implementation, well, it's simply not fulfilling the mandate.
All right, Section 4, Tackling Existential Environmental Threats, Systems Under Pressure. This is where that systems thinking concept is put to the ultimate test. How exactly does a leader tackle overlapping, simultaneous crises in the region?
Just take a look at how the region's vulnerabilities break down. Water scarcity, climate stress, and food systems vulnerability are virtually tied as equal threats, and they are so deeply interconnected. Think about it. You can't create agricultural policy without addressing water, and you definitely cannot address water without managing climate stress. They're not isolated problems. They act as one giant system under pressure.
And this leads to a super important strategic pivot. Water scarcity has to be addressed as a strategic security issue, not just an environmental one. If you frame water merely as a green environmental concern, you completely ignore the true risk it poses to regional stability, economic growth, and cross-border peace. Make no mistake, water is a core driver of governance risk in Western Asia.
And the exact same logic applies to food. Securing food is way more than just planting seeds. Food systems resilience is this massive, interconnected web that links agriculture with international trade, public nutrition, and social protection networks. Keeping that web intact requires really robust regional cooperation and some very specific financing instruments just to ensure that a shock in one area doesn't accidentally trigger a famine in another.
Finally, we reach Section 5, Empowering the Human Core, leaving no one behind. We're shifting our focus all the way from the macro-environmental level right down to the micro-human level. Ultimately, this is the true heart of El Habel's entire approach.
Because at the end of the day, if regional growth is going to be genuinely inclusive, you absolutely must explicitly target vulnerable groups. We are talking about directly embedding women into economic reform, placing youth at the absolute dead center of regional renewal, fiercely advocating for persons with disabilities, and creating accessible development for refugees and displaced communities. If you have an economic boom that simply ignores these groups, well, that's a total failure of leadership.
The source material underscores this point with a really sobering thought. It says, regional averages can hide severe exclusion and unequal access to opportunity. Think about that for a second. A country's GDP might look like it's rising on average, but if you actually dig into the data, certain communities are being left entirely behind in the dust. That's exactly why disaggregated, data-driven public policy is just absolutely crucial. You have to be able to find those hidden inequalities before you can fix them.
So the ultimate goal for the human core is to shift away from emergency relief dependency and move towards adaptive, inclusive social protection systems. It's about finally breaking away from temporary band-aids and endless cycles of humanitarian aid. We need to actually give these populations structural, long-term resilience so they can thrive on their own.
Which leaves us with one massive, overarching question. Are our global institutions truly ready to move from abstract reports to disciplined transformation? Because the blueprint is right here. The tools, the data, the diplomacy, the systems thinking, and that laser focus on the human core. They're all clearly outlined in this strategic guide. The only real question left is whether the international community has the courage and the discipline to actually execute it. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning how global policy shapes our real world. Catch you next time.